The Chinese woman was only moments from reaching the broken bridge when Silas saw her. She carried a heavy wooden suitcase in one hand. She led a weary, dust-covered mule with the other. Silas felt a sharp jolt of panic strike his chest. His 6-year-old daughter, Sarah, stayed close beside him as he pointed toward the ruined crossing. The gorge was a jagged, terrifying wound in the earth. The center of the bridge had collapsed into the churning river below. None of them knew it yet, but this warning would bind their lives together forever. The sun was a red, weeping eye hanging over the Arizona territory. The year was 1887. In the San Pedro Valley, the heat was more than just weather. It was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing against the parched earth. It scorched the dry grass until the hills turned the color of tarnished, forgotten gold. Silas Thorne felt that heat deep in his marrow. He was a man forged by desert grit and cattleman's stubbornness. His hands were rough and calloused from decades of labor. They were etched with the silent stories of hard winters and long, lonely cattle drives. He sat on his wooden porch and watched the shimmering horizon. The wind carried the scent of dry dust and bitter sagebrush. It carried the sharp, medicinal tang of the ancient desert. Silas looked down at the small girl playing in the dirt at his feet. That was Sarah. She was only 6 years old. She was a tiny, flickering spark of life in a very quiet house. She had her mother's bright, searching eyes. Those eyes were a deep, haunting blue. They were the color of the sky just before the first stars come out. Silas felt a sharp, physical pull in his heart every time he looked at her. It had been 3 long, silent years since the fever took Mary.
3 years of empty chairs and cold, bitter coffee. 3 years of shadows claiming the quiet corners of every room. The day before, on May 3rd, 1887, the earth had shivered with subterranean rage. The great Sonora earthquake had reached its trembling fingers north. The historical fury leveled entire towns in Mexico. It shook the very foundations of Arizona. It cracked the ancient mesas like dry biscuits. It sent massive boulders tumbling into the deep, dark gulches. Silas had heard the roar from his ranch house. It sounded like 1,000 freight trains falling from the sky. The sound echoed off the canyon walls for 20 long minutes. He knew the wooden bridge over the San Pedro River was gone. It was a structure built of cedar and iron. It was old and brittle from decades of relentless, punishing sun. The tremors had snapped its heavy legs like mere twigs. Silas knew he had to head to the river crossing immediately. He had to warn anyone coming from the south. The road was a main artery for travelers and heavy freight wagons. In the shadows of the canyon, the drop-off was a death trap. One wrong step in the dark would lead to a plunge into the depths. He walked to the barn with a heavy, purposeful gait. He saddled his horse, a sturdy, deep-chested bay named Red. Red was a dependable animal with a calm, weathered spirit. Silas swung Sarah up onto the worn leather saddle. Her small, pale hands gripped the horse's coarse mane. They rode through the shimmering, distorted heat of the late afternoon. The cicadas screamed in the trees like a million tiny saws. The air was thick with the chalky dust of the recent tremors. As they neared the river, Silas saw a shape in the distance. It was a mule.
The animal was heavily burdened with large, canvas-wrapped packs. Beside the mule, a figure walked with a steady, rhythmic pace. Silas squinted against the brutal, white glare of the sun. The person wore a long, embroidered silk robe. The fabric was a deep, vibrant crimson. It was a garment that did not belong in the choking dust of Arizona. It was too beautiful for this harsh, jagged landscape. He realized the figure was a woman. Her hair was black as a raven's wing. It was dull, but incredibly steady grip. Silas felt a strange, forgotten flutter of curiosity. He did not see many strangers in this isolated part of the territory. Travelers usually kept to the main towns like Tombstone. He certainly did not see women traveling alone in the desert, especially not a Chinese woman. Li Ling carried a heavy burden of history and fear with her every day. She was miles from any settlement or safety. She was heading straight for the jagged edge of the broken bridge. "Hold on tight, Sarah," Silas whispered into his daughter's hair. He urged Red into a faster, more urgent trot. The horse's hooves thudded against the hard-packed earth. The woman did not look up until he was only 50 yards away. She stopped and waited for him to approach. Her expression was calm and completely unreadable. Silas pulled his horse to a dusty, sudden halt. The dust settled around them like a falling, gray curtain. "Ma'am," Silas called out, his voice gravelly and loud. He tipped his sweat-stained, wide-brimmed hat. The woman bowed her head slightly in a silent response. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was soft and melodic. "The road ends beyond that bend, ma'am," Silas said, pointing toward the gorge. "The bridge and part of the riverbank collapsed into the gorge during the quake. One more turn, and your mule would have had nowhere to stop." The woman looked toward the sharp bend in the dusty road. Her dark eyes searched the horizon for the crossing. "I did not know," she replied quietly. Her English was careful and precise. "I am traveling to the settlement beyond the river." Silas shook his head slowly. "The river is running high and angry from the runoff," he warned. The woman looked back at her mule, Fortune. The animal looked utterly exhausted. Its head hung low toward the burning ground. "I have come a very long way," she said, almost to herself. Silas saw the fine white dust on her crimson robe. He saw the deep, hidden exhaustion in her dark eyes. "My name is Silas Thorne," he said, softening his tone. "This is my daughter, Sarah." The woman looked at the little girl perched on the horse. A small, genuine smile finally touched her weary lips. "I am Lilling," she said. Her name lingered softly in the still desert air. "You can't stay out here, Lilling," Silas said firmly. "There are isolated roads, desperate men, and miles without a safe place to stop. And the outlaws in these hills don't care about a broken bridge." Lilling looked at the vast, empty, and terrifying horizon. Red cliffs rose around her like silent walls. "I have no place to go back to," she said quietly. "Sometimes surviving means walking toward people you do not know. Sometimes turning back is no longer possible." Silas looked down at his daughter, Sarah. The girl was staring at Li Ling with wide, curious eyes. Silas was a naturally cautious, guarded man. The world was dangerous for a single father with a child, but he could not leave a woman to die in this furnace. "My ranch is 5 miles back," Silas said, making a choice. "You can rest there for the night, and the mule can drink. We can figure out a way across the river tomorrow." Li Ling hesitated for a long, heavy moment. She saw the hidden kindness in Silas's weathered face. She saw the honesty in his steady blue gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she whispered. They turned back toward the ranch as the light began to change. Silas kept Red at a slow walk so Li Ling would not have to hurry. The sun began to dip behind the jagged purple mountains. The sky turned a bruised plum and a burning orange. The shadows stretched long across the valley floor. They reached the Thorne Ranch just as twilight fell. It was a humble, sturdy place built of adobe and timber. The walls were thick to keep out the midday heat. Li Ling looked at the sagging porch and the peeling paint. She saw the profound, echoing loneliness of the house. It was a place that had forgotten the gentle touch of a woman. Silas showed her to the small guest room. The room was dusty and smelled of cedar and old memories. He went to the kitchen to start a fire in the iron stove. He was a man of few words and even fewer social graces. He fried some salt pork in a blackened skillet. He boiled some plain, unseasoned brown beans. Lilling came into the kitchen after a short while. She had washed the desert dust from her face. She looked like a graceful spirit in the dim lamplight. She saw Silas struggling with a heavy boiling pot. "May I help you?" she asked softly. Silas stepped back, surprised by her presence. Lilling took the wooden spoon from his hand. She moved with a fluid grace he had never seen. She found a few dried herbs in the back of the cupboard. Silas had forgotten he even possessed such things. She transformed the simple meal into something fragrant. The smell of spice and home filled the cold kitchen. They sat at the old wooden table in comfortable silence. Sarah ate with a hunger she usually didn't show. "This is very good," the little girl whispered. Lilling smiled warmly back at her. "It is the heart that makes the food," Lilling said. After dinner, Silas sat on the front porch in the dark. Lilling joined him by the wooden railing. She looked up at the stars, which were bright and sharp. "Why are you traveling to Fairbank?" Silas asked. Lilling remained silent for a moment. "My father was a merchant in San Francisco," she said. "He insisted that I learned English. I worked beside American families for several years. Listening became my first teacher." Silas nodded. That explained the care and precision in her speech.
My father died last year from a sickness of the lungs, Leland continued. Before he died, he arranged for me to marry a man in Fairbank. A man I have never met. The wagon I traveled with turned back after the earthquake. No one wanted to wait for a Chinese woman traveling without family. So I continued alone. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Do you want to marry him? He asked. Leland looked into the darkness beyond the porch. I want a home, she said softly. I want to feel the earth stay still beneath my feet. Silas thought about the earthquake and the shifting ground. The earth is never truly still, Leland, he said. We only learn how to keep our balance while it moves. The next few days were a blur of intense heat. The river was still too high to cross safely. The mud on the steep banks was thick and dangerous. Leland stayed at the ranch out of practical necessity. She began to clean the room Silas had neglected for years. She swept away the gray cobwebs from the high corners. She mended the holes in Sarah's torn cotton dresses. She taught the little girl new, beautiful words. Sarah learned the names of desert flowers in Leland's tongue. Silas watched them from the dark door of the barn. He saw Leland brushing Sarah's long hair. He saw the house slowly coming back to life. The windows seemed brighter in the morning sun. The air inside felt warmer and less like a tomb. It was a dangerous feeling for a man like him.
He was a cattleman with a heart that had been broken once, but in the quiet of the ranch, the world felt far away. The mountains acted as a wall against the outside world. One afternoon, Silas went into Fairbank for supplies. He needed flour, coffee, and ammunition. He heard the low, ugly talk at the general store. The men leaned against the counter, chewing tobacco and spitting onto the floor. They were angry about the slow bridge repairs. Then the talk turned sharply to the China woman. Someone saw a red silk dress at Thorne's place, a miner said. Thorne's hiding a celestial, another man grumbled. It ain't right for a white man to do that. Silas felt his blood turn cold in his veins. He bought his supplies in stony silence. He rode back to the ranch with a heavy heart. The sun felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. He found Leland working in the small garden patch. Leland, you have to stay inside the house, Silas said. His voice was brittle with worry. He told her exactly what he had heard in town. Leland's face went pale under the harsh sun. I am a burden to you, she said. No, Silas replied without hesitation. You are a light in this dark, empty house. That night, a group of riders came to the ranch. Silas heard the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats in the distance. He saw the flickering, menacing light of lanterns. He reached for his Winchester rifle. He told Leland and Sarah to hide in the root cellar. Silas stepped out onto the front porch, standing tall. He stood with the rifle held ready in his steady hands. There were 5 men on horseback, their faces masked by shadows. Thorne, the leader called out. It was Miller, a local bully with a mean streak. We know you're hiding her in there, Silas. Hand her over to us right now. We'll take her to the marshal in Tombstone. Silas leveled his rifle directly at Miller's chest. There's nobody here but me and my daughter, Silas said. His voice was cold and as hard as iron. Go home, Miller, before the night gets worse. Miller laughed, a dry and hateful sound. We saw the mule in the corral, Silas. Don't lie to us for a stranger. Suddenly, the front door creaked open behind him. Leland stepped out onto the porch, her head held high. She was wearing one of Mary's old, faded cotton dresses. The fabric was worn but clean. I am here, she said, her voice clear and unafraid. The men on horseback went suddenly quiet. I am a simple traveler, Leland said to the shadows. I mean no harm to your town or your families. Miller climbed down from his horse with a swagger. Silas stepped firmly in front of Leland. One more step, Miller, Silas warned. He clicked the lever of the rifle. The sound was sharp in the still night air. Sarah appeared in the open doorway behind Leland. Her small hands gripped the wooden frame. Don't take her away, the little girl cried.
Leland stepped back and placed herself protectively in front of Sarah. The sight of the terrified child stopped the men cold. Miller looked at the frightened little girl standing behind Leland. He saw the raw fear in Sarah's innocent eyes. He looked at Silas's unwavering hands on the rifle. The riders looked at each other, their bravado fading. This ain't over, Thorne, Miller muttered. He turned back to his horse and mounted. The riders vanished into the darkness of the valley.
Silas felt the adrenaline leave his body. His knees felt shaky for a long moment. He sat down on the porch steps. Lilling knelt down beside him and placed a hand on his arm. "Why did you risk everything for me?" she asked softly. Silas looked into the darkness of the canyon. "Because I was the one who warned you about the bridge," he said. "I couldn't save you from one danger and then abandon you to another. And because Sarah already trusted you. Before I understood what was happening, I trusted you too." Lilling's hand remained gently on his arm. They both knew it had become much more than a favor. Have you ever trusted a stranger when everyone else told you not to? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice is part of this community. The next week was a time of peace before the storm. The river finally began to recede. The brown, churning water lowered day by day. The thick mud dried into a hard, cracked crust. Lilling knew it was time to fulfill her obligation. She packed her small suitcase with trembling hands. Silas watched her from the kitchen window.
He wanted to tell her to stay at the ranch forever, but pride held his tongue. He believed a poor rancher had little to offer a woman like her. "I will take you to the crossing," Silas said, his voice thick. They rode out in the early, cold morning light. Sarah sat behind Lilling on the mule, her face buried in silk. They reached the muddy riverbank. Lilling looked across to the other, unknown side. The road to Fairbanks stretched out like a sentence. "Thank you for everything, Silas," she said. She pulled out a small, exquisite jade necklace. She placed it around Sarah's neck with a kiss. "Keep this with you always, little one," Lilling whispered. "It will bring you luck, safety, and my love." Sarah hugged her as tight as she could. "Please don't go," the little girl cried. Lilling looked at Silas one last time. Her dark eyes were full of unshed tears. "I must go," she said softly. She led her mule Fortune into the cold, brown water. Silas watched her reach the dry ground on the far side. She did not look back. Silas turned red around and headed back toward the ranch. The ranch felt like a tomb the moment they arrived. The silence was louder than it had ever been before. Sarah refused to eat her supper. She sat on the porch and stared at the empty road. Silas tried to focus on his cattle in the north pasture, but his mind was always on the river. He thought about Lilling arriving in the cold, hostile town.
He thought about her living in a house without a soul. The thought was like a jagged knife in his gut. Lilling reached Fairbank before the next sunrise. The man her father had chosen was polite but cold. There was no kindness in his eyes. She realized she would always be a duty there, never a family. Before daylight fully arrived, she turned her mule back. She headed toward the Thorn Ranch. By the following afternoon, the sky had turned a deep, bruised black. A violent late spring storm was building over the southern mountains. Old Mrs. Reed from the neighboring homestead had arrived earlier. She had taken shelter at the ranch before the storm grew worse. She wrapped a blanket around Sarah's shoulders. Thunder shook the windows of the adobe house. Silas knew the lethal danger of the desert rain. He knew a flash flood was coming. The San Pedro would rise again, faster than before. He thought of the road to Fairbank and the low washes. If Lilling was on that road, she would be trapped. "Sarah, stay with Mrs. Reed," Silas said. "Do exactly what she tells you." He turned to the older woman with an urgent look. "Keep her inside until I return." He grabbed his yellow oilskin slicker. He pushed Red into a hard, dangerous gallop. The rain began to fall in blinding sheets. The wind whipped the sand into a stinging frenzy.
Silas reached the river in record time. The water was already a wall of brown fury. He saw a small, dark figure on the far bank. It was Lilling, struggling in the deep mud. The water was rising rapidly around her knees. "Lilling!" Silas screamed over the roar of the storm. She looked up, her hair plastered to her face. Terror filled her face. Silas did not hesitate for a single second. He urged Red into the churning cold water. The horse stumbled against hidden, rolling rocks. Silas held the reins with all his strength. They fought against the powerful, bone-chilling current. Fortune tore free from the lead rope in the panic.
The mule scrambled toward a rocky rise as the water surged. Lilling tried out, but Silas only had seconds. He leaned down and grabbed Lilling's small, wet hand. His grip was like iron. He pulled her up behind him on the soaked saddle. They fought their way back through the violent current. It was a raw struggle for life and for love. They finally reached the home side of the river. They collapsed onto the mud, soaked to the bone. The rain continued to pour down in the dark. Silas pulled Lilling into his arms, shielding her. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. Rain washed the dust from their clothes. It washed away the distance they had tried to keep. "You came back," he whispered into her wet hair. "I couldn't leave you, Silas," Lilling sobbed.
I realized I already had a home. I already had a family. They rode back to the ranch together. Sarah was waiting just inside the open doorway. Mrs. Reed was holding firmly to her shoulder. Her jade necklace was glowing in the dim light. The little girl ran to them with a cry of pure joy. Lilling took Sarah in her arms, weeping with relief. "I am staying," Lilling said firmly, looking at Silas. "I am never leaving this house again." Silas stepped closer, his hat in his hand. His voice trembled more than it ever had before. "Then don't stay as my guest," he said. "Stay as my wife." Sarah looked from one to the other with shining eyes. Lilling smiled through her tears. "I thought you would never ask," she whispered. Silas felt the 3 years of silence in his heart break. He felt a warmth he hadn't known since Mary died. Near dawn, Fortune appeared at the corral gate. The animal was alive, though exhausted and trembling. Lilling buried her face against the animal's neck and wept. Arizona law refused to recognize the life they chose, so they crossed into New Mexico territory. They found a sympathetic preacher to marry them. Sarah stood between them, holding Lilling's hand. The preacher looked at the rugged cattleman. He looked at the woman in the crimson silk robe. "Men may build walls with laws," he said.
But love is the bridge that carries a family home. When they returned to the ranch, Silas carried Lilling across the threshold. For the first time in years, the house rang with laughter. The town of Fairbank did not like the news. Miller and his men grumbled for many years, but Silas Thorne did not care what the world thought. He was a man who had finally found peace. He built a new, beautiful garden for Lilling. He fenced it off from the biting desert winds. He taught her how to ride like a true Arizonan. She taught him how to hope for a future. Years passed, but some stories never faded. Travelers still crossed the San Pedro on a new bridge. Few remembered the great earthquake of 1887. Many remembered the ranch where a stranger found a home. Silas often said the broken bridge had saved his life. Lilling would simply smile and hold his hand. The earth had finally become still for them, not because the earthquakes ended, but because they had found home in each other. The desert was no longer a place of thorns and dust. It was a place of blooming flowers and shared dreams. Have you ever met someone who changed the meaning of home for you? Tell us your story below and subscribe for more heartfelt tales from the American frontier. AI disclosure. Artificial intelligence tools assisted with research, script development, visual creation, and audio production. All materials were reviewed, edited, and arranged into an original storytelling work by the channel creator.